There is a photograph, though most people have never seen it. It was taken sometime in the early 1940s, inside Waddesdon Manor, one of those sprawling Rothschild estates in the English countryside, where the ceilings are painted by masters and the silence is expensive. The photograph shows a long dining table set for 20, perhaps more. Crystal glasses catch the afternoon light. The silverware is arranged with the precision of a museum exhibition. But no one is sitting down. The chairs are empty. It's not a picture of absence, exactly. It's a picture of waiting. Waiting for a family that is scattered across continents. Waiting for sons who will not return from the war. Waiting for a kind of closeness that wealth, for all its permissions, cannot manufacture. That image, whether you've seen it or not, is the metaphor. A table set for a family that could never quite gather. A dynasty built on connection, on brothers who communicated in code across borders, on bloodlines carefully managed and fortunes painstakingly preserved. And yet, behind the gold-leaf doors and the marble halls, a loneliness so vast it could swallow generations whole. This is the story of the Rothschild family. And it is not the story most people think they know. The world knows the Rothschilds as architects of modern finance, as collectors of art and estates, as the family whose name became synonymous with wealth itself. They are studied in economics courses and whispered about in conspiracy theories. They are a symbol, a shorthand, a legend that has long since detached from the people who actually lived inside it. But symbols don't weep, legends don't bury children, and behind every fortune counted in the billions, there were human beings who woke in the night, who wrote letters no one answered, who stood in rooms filled with priceless things, and felt the particular emptiness that comes when you realize no one around you sees you, only the name you carry. This is not a story about money. It is a story about what money costs, about the performance that legacy requires, about the men and women who were born into a machinery so vast, so precisely calibrated, that their own desires became irrelevant, and about the question that every generation of Rothschilds has had to answer in private, when the bankers have gone home and the chandeliers are dimmed: what did we give up to become this? To understand the loneliness at the heart of the Rothschild empire, you have to begin in a place where loneliness was a matter of survival. Frankfurt, 1760s. The Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto, a narrow, suffocating street where 2,000 people were crowded into conditions that would be unimaginable a century later. The gates locked at night. On Sundays and Christian holidays, no Jew was permitted to leave. The houses leaned together like old men, and the smell of too many lives pressed too close was inescapable. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born into this, not into wealth, not into influence, into a kind of regulated invisibility. His father was a money changer, a small-time dealer in coins and curiosities. Mayer was the fourth of 8 children, and like so many boys in the Judengasse, he learned early that the world was not designed to accommodate him. That survival required cleverness. That trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and just as rare. When his parents died, his father when Mayer was 12, his mother a year later, he was orphaned in the cruelest sense. Not just parentless, but without moorings. He was sent away to study, to apprentice, to learn the trade of rare coins and the delicate social algebra of dealing with princes who would never invite you to their table but needed your expertise nonetheless. What does a boy learn in such circumstances? He learns to keep important things inside. He learns that the face you show the world and the self you protect in private are two different constructions. He learns that family blood is the only alliance that might endure. Mayer Amschel Rothschild returned to Frankfurt and through a combination of brilliance and relentless strategy built something from almost nothing. But the lesson of the ghetto never left him. The world was hostile. Trust no one outside the family, and if you are going to rise, make sure your children rise together. This was not warmth, it was architecture. By the time Mayer Amschel died in 1812, he had done what most men only dream of. He had turned poverty into proximity to power. The Rothschilds were bankers to princes, financiers of armies, facilitators of the kind of transactions that decide the fates of nations. But his true achievement was not the fortune, it was the system. Mayer had 5 sons, Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Karl, and James. and in a decision that would define the family for generations, he sent them out like arrows from a single bow. Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, Paris. 5 cities, 5 brothers, 1 family. The symbol they chose was 5 arrows bound together, a visual reminder: alone we break, together we are unbreakable. It worked staggeringly well. The brothers communicated in Judendeutsch, a language their competitors could not decode. They moved faster than governments, knew more than diplomats. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, it was Nathan Rothschild in London who knew the outcome before the British government did, and who made a fortune on that knowledge. They were united by blood and by paranoia. The outside world was still the outside world. Marriages were arranged within the family. Cousins married cousins, fortunes stayed consolidated, secrets stayed inside the walls. But what does it do to a person to be an arrow, to be aimed at a target you did not choose, to perform the role of brother, of son, of dynasty builder, knowing that your individual desires are secondary to the machine? Nathan Rothschild, the most brilliant of them, died at 58 in 1836. He had built an empire. He had also worked himself into an abscess that turned septic. He spent his final days in agony, surrounded by wealth that could buy anything except more time. Salomon in Vienna grew old in a palace so grand it made monarchs jealous. But he was also a Jew in a city that tolerated him only because of his utility. When the revolutions of 1848 erupted, he fled, a man of 74, abandoning everything he had built because the hatred was older than his fortune and just as durable. The brothers had built something extraordinary, but they had also set a precedent. The family comes first. Your life is not entirely your own. You are part of something larger, and that something requires sacrifice. This was the inheritance, not just money, but obligation, and loneliness dressed up as duty. By the mid-19th century, Rothschild was no longer just a surname. It was a category, a myth, a family that controlled, by some estimates, half the world's wealth. They built palaces, Waddesdon, Ferrières, Mantmore. They collected art, Rembrandts, Vermeers, entire libraries of illuminated manuscripts. They bred racehorses, cultivated vineyards, funded archaeological digs. The public saw magnificence, and magnificence is what they were supposed to see. But what was it like to be born into that? To be a child of the 3rd or 4th generation, raised in a house with 40 bedrooms, taught by private tutors, expected to marry a cousin you barely knew in order to preserve the bloodline? Consider Charlotte von Rothschild, born in 1819 in Frankfurt, daughter of Karl. She was raised with every advantage: education, culture, beauty. But her marriage was arranged. She wed her cousin Lionel, of the English branch, when she was 17. She moved to London, a city where she did not speak the language fluently, into a household where her primary role was to produce heirs and manage a social calendar that functioned as economic diplomacy. She did her duty. She bore 5 children. She presided over estates. She was gracious, accomplished, admired, and she was profoundly isolated. In her letters, most of which were never meant for publication, she writes of homesickness that lasted decades, of a longing for her mother that no amount of luxury could ease, of the peculiar strain of being surrounded by people, servants, children, visitors, and still feeling utterly alone. This was the bargain. You got wealth, security, a name that opened every door. But you also got the performance, the need to be a Rothschild in public at all times, to smile correctly, to marry correctly, to make sure that every decision you made reinforced the architecture your great-grandfather had designed in the Judengasse. And if you wanted something else, if you wanted to marry for love, or to live quietly, or to pursue a life that didn't involve banks and bonds and breeding, then you were a problem, a crack in the facade. And the family had very sophisticated ways of managing cracks. For all their power, for all the careful strategy and intermarriage and financial genius, the Rothschilds could not control history. The First World War shattered the illusion of European unity that had allowed them to thrive. The family had branches in countries that were suddenly trying to kill each other. The French Rothschilds and the Austrian Rothschilds were technically on opposite sides of a conflict that killed millions. But the real devastation came later. In 1938, the Nazis marched into Austria. The Vienna Rothschilds, descended from Salomon, the brother who had built palaces and hobnobbed with emperors, were forced to flee. Their estates were seized. Their art collections, which represented generations of care and connoisseurship, were looted. Louis von Rothschild was arrested and held for over a year, released only after the family paid the largest ransom in history up to that point. The French branch fared little better. When the Nazis occupied France, the Rothschild estates were taken over. Fourier's, that monument to 19th-century grandeur, became a headquarters for the Luftwaffe. The Nazis turned the ballroom into a command center. They hung swastikas in rooms where Proust had once dined. Some members of the family escaped to England, to America. Others were not so fortunate. And here is the thing that biographies often gloss over. Trauma doesn't respect wealth. The Rothschilds who fled carried their fear with them. The ones who survived carried their guilt. And the ones who came after, born in the 1940s, the 1950s, inherited a legacy that was no longer just about banks and estates. It was about loss, about the knowledge that everything their great-grandfathers had built could be taken away in an afternoon. Baron Guy de Rothschild, who rebuilt the French branch after the war, wrote in his memoirs about the permanent insecurity he felt, even after the estates were restored, even after the fortune was rebuilt. He described it as a kind of background hum, a low-level anxiety that never quite went away. You could have everything, he seemed to say, and you could still lose it, and the memory of losing it, or hearing about your relatives who did, becomes part of your inheritance too. What does it mean to be born a Rothschild in the late 20th century? When the name is no longer synonymous with absolute dominance but still carries the weight of legend. It means growing up in houses that are museums. It means being taught, implicitly and explicitly, that you are part of something exceptional, that you have responsibilities. That privacy is a luxury you do not entirely possess. Jacob Rothschild, born in 1936, once said in an interview that he spent much of his youth trying to figure out whether he wanted the life that had been prepared for him. He was brilliant, well-educated, expected to take his place in the family bank, but he didn't quite fit. He was more interested in art, in history, in philanthropy that had nothing to do with profit margins. He eventually broke from the main family business and started his own investment trust. It was a quiet rebellion, the kind that only makes sense inside a dynasty. He didn't renounce the name, but he refused to be entirely defined by it. And yet, even that independence came with a cost. In later interviews, he spoke about the loneliness of that choice, about feeling caught between two worlds, the world of legacy and duty that his ancestors had built, and the world of personal meaning that he wanted to inhabit. His cousin, Eric de Rothschild, who took over the family's wine estates in France, described something similar. He said that being a Rothschild means that people assume they know you before you've said a word, that every introduction is colored by expectations, by assumptions, by the mythology that has attached itself to your surname. You are not quite a person. You are a representative, a symbol, and the loneliness of that, of never being sure if people see you, is a kind of isolation that wealth cannot solve. Not everyone stayed. Throughout the generations there have been Rothschilds who walked away quietly, without scandal, simply choosing a different life. Some married outside the faith, outside the family, and were quietly distanced. Others pursued careers in art, in academia, in fields that had nothing to do with banking. They kept the name but shed the obligation. These are the Rothschilds you don't read about. The ones who chose privacy over legacy. Who decided that the weight of the name was too heavy, or that the performance required was too exhausting, or that they simply wanted to be ordinary. There is no drama in these stories, no tabloid headlines, just people who looked at the long dining table set for 20 and decided they would rather eat alone, in a smaller room, on their own terms. And the family, for the most part, let them go, because the machinery could function without them. The dynasty could survive the occasional defection. But what does it say about a family that some of its members choose anonymity over belonging, that the price of being included is, for some, simply too high? In all the books written about the Rothschilds, the financial histories, the biographies, the conspiracy theories, there is a question that rarely gets asked. Were they happy, not successful, not influential, not wealthy beyond measure, but happy? Did Mayer Amschel, working himself to exhaustion in the Judengasse, feel joy, or only the relief of survival? Did the five brothers scattered across Europe, communicating in code, ever wish they could just be brothers, that they could sit together without calculating interest rates and political alliances? Did the wives, the daughters, the ones who were married off to preserve the bloodline, did they ever feel chosen for themselves? Did the children raised in palaces ever feel at home? These are not questions that financial records can answer, but they are the questions that matter when you are trying to understand what a life actually felt like, as opposed to what it looked like. And the answers, pieced together from letters and memoirs and the occasional unguarded interview, suggest something uncomfortable. The Rothschilds built an empire. But empires are not designed for happiness. They are designed for endurance, for legacy, for the preservation of power across generations. And the people inside the empire, the ones whose names were on the letterhead, whose faces appeared in the society pages, were, in many ways, as trapped as they were privileged. Trapped by expectation, by duty, by the knowledge that their individual lives mattered less than the continuation of the family. So what remains? The estates, some of them. Waddesdon is now managed by the National Trust, open to tourists who walk through rooms that once held private sorrows. Ferrières still stands, though it is no longer a residence. It is a venue, a museum, a monument to a way of life that no longer exists. The art collections dispersed. Some pieces returned after years of legal battles over Nazi looting. Others sold, donated, scattered across museums worldwide. The banks, still operational in some form, though no longer the financial juggernauts they once were. The world of finance changed. Governments grew larger. Regulations multiplied, and the Rothschilds, for all their brilliance, could not maintain the absolute dominance they once held. And the family itself, still here, still wealthy, though the fortune is no longer concentrated in the way it was in the 19th century. Still influential, though in quieter ways, through philanthropy, through environmental conservation, through the careful management of legacy. But the empire, as such, is over. The age when five brothers could coordinate the movement of gold across Europe and effectively control the financial stability of nations, that age is gone. What they left behind is more complicated than buildings and bank accounts. They left behind a case study in what happens when human beings are organized like a business, when marriages are mergers and children are investments and love is secondary to legacy. They left behind letters, hundreds of them written by people who had everything except the freedom to be fully themselves. They left behind a name that still carries weight, still provokes reaction, still serves as shorthand for a kind of power that most people will never understand and many people resent. And they left behind a lesson, though it is not the one they intended, that you can build something that lasts for centuries. You can accumulate wealth beyond imagining. You can have your name in history books and your portrait in museums. You can do all of that, and you can still be lonely. You can still spend your life performing a role instead of living it. You can still wonder, in the quiet moments, what you might have been if you had been born with a different name, if you had been allowed to want something different, if the table had been smaller, and the family had been closer, and the price of belonging had been something other than the surrender of your interior life. The story of the Rothschild family is, in the end, improbable. Improbable that a boy from the Judengasse could found a dynasty. Improbable that five brothers could coordinate an empire before the age of telephones. Improbable that a family could maintain coherence and influence across centuries through wars and revolutions and the wholesale restructuring of the global economy. But the improbability cuts both ways. It is also improbable that so much wealth produced so much sadness, that so much togetherness, the intermarriage, the constant communication, the business dinners that blurred into family gatherings, could coexist with so much isolation, that people could live in houses with 100 rooms and still feel unseen, that they could be surrounded by family and still feel alone. The Rothschilds were not villains, though they have been cast as such, nor were they saints, though some tried to be. They were people, brilliant, flawed, dutiful, lonely people, who were born into a system that demanded more than it gave back, and they played the role, most of them, most of the time. They carried the name, they managed the estates, they made the marriages, they raised the children who would do the same. But in the letters they wrote late at night, in the memoirs published after their deaths, in the rare moments when the performance slipped, you can see the truth. They were tired. Tired of being symbols. Tired of the expectations. Tired of the loneliness that comes from being seen as a dynasty rather than as individuals. And yet they kept going, because that is what you do when you are part of something larger than yourself. When you are an arrow, and the bow has already been drawn, you keep going. You fulfill your purpose. You hope that the people who come after will understand the cost. And you set the table, one more time, for a gathering that may never feel quite close enough. Return for a moment to that photograph. The one taken at Waddesdon in the 1940s. The long table. The empty chairs. It was not taken as a statement. It was not meant to be symbolic. It was simply a documentary image, a record of a room prepared for an event that for one reason or another did not happen as planned. But it endures, that image or the idea of it, because it captures something true. The Rothschilds built a family that was supposed to be unbreakable. 5 arrows bound together. Marriages within the family to keep the fortune intact. Constant communication. Mutual support. And yet the chairs were often empty, because people die, because wars scatter families, because children grow up and want different things, because even the most carefully constructed dynasty cannot legislate love or closeness or the kind of intimacy that makes loneliness bearable. The table was always set, the inheritance was always managed, the name was always protected, but the people, the actual human beings who carried that name, were often somewhere else, in other countries, in other centuries, in the privacy of their own thoughts, wondering what it might have been like to sit at a smaller table, with fewer expectations, and just be themselves. This is the untold story of the Rothschild family behind closed doors. Not a story of conspiracy or world domination, but a story of human cost, of what it takes to build something that lasts, and what gets lost in the building. A story of brilliant people who did extraordinary things, and who paid for those things in ways that ledgers cannot measure. A story of loneliness, dressed in silk and housed in marble. A story of empty chairs. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.